recording, and I'm going to get us live on, I'm going to work on getting us live on Facebook, and then let people into the room, and then we'll go to Terry. So let me change this to speaker view, and I'm going to mute everybody just as we start.
Is that a go, Lee?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Give me just one moment. I will give you the go.
Okay.
Just takes a second to get everything set up on the Facebook. And it's going slow for some reason today. Yeah, I'm on Facebook. All right, it's struggling, so I'm gonna let folks into the room, and then we'll just start the Facebook stream just as soon as it is ready. Cool? All right, I'm gonna click start webinar now, and people should start to come in. Hi, Terry, we're starting.
Oh, great. Thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Podcasting LGBTQ History Part 1, hosted by the GLBT Historical Society. My name is Terry Beswick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society, and I'm so excited to be here today to introduce today's event with an illustrious panel discussion moderated by Rick Oculto. But first, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land. I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible in the chat and be recognized as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous people. Also, I want to thank my colleague Lee Pfeffer, Museum Experience Manager at the Society and one of today's panelists, for all their work in organizing today's event. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the heart of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood, and the Dr. John P. DeCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. And although the archives remain closed due to the pandemic, please do check out our growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources at glbthistory.org. And the good news is that our museum has recently reopened to visitors within COVID safety protocols on an appointment-only basis through our website. So if you're in the Bay Area, please do stop by and support our work in queer public history. Speaking of supporting our work, please do be sure to join us at our annual gala, Reunion Making History, next Friday, October 16th. We have a fabulous lineup of entertainment planned as our extended family comes together to celebrate some very special history makers in our community. Tickets are available with a donation in any amount on our website at glbthistory.org/gala. Now, on to today's event, Podcasting LGBTQ History, Part 1. So this event is being recorded and live streamed on Zoom and on Facebook and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. If you are watching with us on Zoom, we welcome your active participation in the forum. We encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box and at the bottom of your screen, and post any comments in the chat box. Now, many people are watching the live stream on Facebook, and we welcome you all, but please note that our moderator will not see your comments and questions there in real time. And finally, with no further ado, allow me to introduce today's moderator, who will introduce the panel and the discussion. Rick Oculto, he, him pronouns, is the education director at Our Family Coalition, a nonprofit organization dedicated to serving LGBTQ families with children. In his role, he has provided professional and personal development workshops for thousands of education professionals and families nationwide. Rick started the first transgender youth group in the Bay Area, was a lead organizer in the Fair Education Act Implementation Coalition, and has provided consultation for foreign ambassadors wanting to learn promising practices for improving the lives of LGBTQ people in their home countries. And with that, Rick, I'll leave it to you to introduce the panel and today's discussion. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Terry. You know, it's really funny listening to my own bio being read out. It is, it's humbling and embarrassing in a lot of ways. And so, for the panelists, I'm going to give them the agency to be able to introduce themselves. But I do want to open this, I guess, dialogue, this conversation by saying, you know, we have a lot of different things that are coming up today in present time. And that are affected by how we have seen and talked about history. In the past, we've had things like encyclopedias and radio shows and different types of media to tell us about how we absorb this information. Podcasts have really filled an interesting niche in how we share this information and how we're really able to speak to these different things. The folks that we're going to be engaging with today have been at the forefront of leading the conversation in this particular fashion. And so it is with my great pleasure that I get to introduce the folks that we are speaking with. I'm going to go alphabetically so that there's no assumption of favoritism on my part. And so I'm going to start with Alice McInnes. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alice McInnes. We've got two Alices here, so I'm Alice M for the duration of this panel. I use she, her pronouns. Before I say anything else, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm a co-host of the queer history podcast Queer as Fact. So we talk about queer history from all around the world and all across time, twice a month. I'm also just completing a master's in queer representation in museums, interviewing queer people to talk about their experiences or lack of experience of seeing themselves represented in a museum context. And I'm a public librarian working as much as I can to get queer content into exhibitions and so forth in a public library. Thank you to the LGBT Historical Society for having me today.
All right, thank you, Alice. Then next we'll go to Alice Y. Home.
Hi, thanks, Rick. Hi, everybody. My name is Alice Y. Hom. I'm the host and a founder of Historically Queer, a podcast on the historical and contemporary stories of activism and community building by LGBTQ people of color. I consider myself a community historian. My paid work is I work in philanthropy, which is near and dear to me as well. I am on Ohlone land in Oakland right now. Consider myself also a Los Angelino because that's where I was born and raised. What else about me? I do think that my being a queer API person, I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, has shaped what I do in my life. And part of that is always bringing in and centering and including stories by LGBTQ API folks, but also broadly queer and trans people of color, because I'm very much aware of the multiple erasures that happen for LGBTQ people of color, particularly in present day and in the documentation of our stories, histories, activism. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Alice Y. All right, let's go on to Eric Marcus.
You would think I would know how to do this by now. It's kind of sad. Thank you for having me today. And in fact, the GLBT Historical Society figures prominently in my podcast. And the podcast is Making Gay History. And what we do is bring LGBTQ history to life through the voices of the people who lived it. But it's drawn principally from my archive of 100 interviews that I did more than 30 years ago for a book called Making History, second edition called Making Gay History. And I sat for hours in the GLBT Historical Society's library in Noe Valley in 1988, 89, going through every single copy of The Advocate and One Magazine and Mattachine Review and The Ladder, because there was no timeline of the movement. And I had to build a timeline before I could write a book for which I recorded all of these interviews. And I will apologize in advance. FedEx seems to show up every time I'm on a Zoom call. And I missed a package yesterday that they are supposed to redeliver today, and I'm sure it will be shortly. So I apologize in advance. Oh, there was one more thing. I produce a second podcast. It's called Those Who Were There, Voices from the Holocaust. It's a project of Yale University's Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies.
Thank you so much, Eric. Jason Best, you're up.
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm also a host on Queer as Fact alongside Alice. I host some of our Queer as Fiction episodes where we talk about pieces of queer historical fiction. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon the land upon which I'm live streaming, the Yalukit Whelan clan of the Boonwurrung, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Yeah, I'm a podcaster with Queer as Fact, and I did my master's in advertising, where I wrote a thesis that wasn't really about advertising. It was actually an excuse to write about queer issues. And I wrote about the YouTube as a queer public sphere, specifically in relation to how queer YouTubers responded to gay marriage legalization in the United States. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Jason. And then finally, last but not least, Lee Pfeffer.
Hey everyone, I'm Lee Pfeffer. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the, as Terry mentioned, the manager of museum experience here at the Society. And I also am the host and producer of History is Gay podcast. Our tagline is because history has never been as straight as you think. As many folks, you know, who are in this sphere will know. I started doing the podcast a couple of years ago, and through that met wonderful people like Rick and Terry, and started getting involved with the Society, and now I work there. So it's a nice little kind of bookend to be able to say, started from the podcast, came to the Society, and now we're bringing it all together, which is wonderful. I live on Ohlone land in Albany, California, and when I'm not, you know, working in San Francisco, when there's not a global pandemic happening. And my background is I had a history degree and a theater degree, and I've worked in various roles in museums and nonprofits for the last several years. And I'm excited to be here with everybody. Yay.
Wonderful. We've got a great panel, and everybody has reminded me. I am, and I apologize, I didn't say this earlier, but I am on Ramaytush Ohlone land as well here in San Francisco, and I would like to honor that. With that, as if some of you have talked a little bit in your intros about you know, how you got into podcasting, why you got into podcasting. I imagine for those of you, especially those who started your podcast earlier, that this wasn't, you know, there are a bunch of us on screen right now, but this was not a thing. Any comments around, you know, how you got into podcasting, why you started it?
Who wants to start? Ooh.
I think, Rich, you're going to have to call on us. Not that we're shy, but we're afraid of stepping on each other.
Oh. All right. Well, I mean, you're unmuted, Eric. So.
Oh, thanks. That's my own fault. I started my podcast because I got fired from a job. It was actually, it's true. I was fired from my job at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in 2015, and I actually had worked for myself for almost my entire career, writing books principally. And what you do when you're in your mid-50s and you've been fired from a job with no hope of being hired anywhere on staff because of your age, principally, you have to assess what your assets are and figure out what you're going to do next. And I knew that the New York Public Library had just finished digitizing my entire collection of audio files. And so I made a lot of coffee dates and lunch dates, took a lot of people out to have brainstorming conversations. One of those conversations was with History Unerased. It's a nonprofit that develops LGBTQ inclusive American history curricula. And they like the idea of using clips from my archive to anchor resources and lesson plans. I should say resources and curriculum in social studies. And I then hired my neighbor, who was a former BBC producer, to cut the tape. And when she got down to, we were going to do 6-minute, 3-minute clips. When she got down to 18 minutes, 15 minutes, she said, "This sounds like a podcast." And she said, "I don't know how to make podcasts. I'm going to go to podcast school." And long story short, 5 weeks after she went to podcast school, we launched Making Gay History with no expectations other than we had a grant and we had to meet the conditions of the grant and had to have something out for LGBT History Month 4 years ago. And we produced a 10-episode season and launched our fully fledged website within 5 weeks. And just as a contrast, the Holocaust podcast I do, we spent 2 years developing it. So I don't recommend doing what we did, but it was, as people often say, sometimes it's good not to know what you're getting yourself into. And here we are. This is 4 years later. We've had 3.3 million episode downloads. We've produced 80 episodes over the course of 8 seasons. We just launched our 8th season last week.
Wow, that is amazing. And quite a story of how something that is not traditionally seen as a positive, turning into something really, really great.
My partner kept telling me that, because I was rather depressed about being fired. He said, "Oh, what's that? The saying that everyone says about when you're fired? Sometimes it's the best thing that ever happened." At the time, it didn't feel that way, but it was the absolute best thing that ever happened. It's traumatic being fired. It's only happened to me twice in my life. But and I had to make a living and had to figure out what to do. And also, I was 55 and I wasn't ready to retire.
Right.
I couldn't afford to retire either. So.
Right. Now, for the others of you, I'm imagining that like a firing did not happen in the case of the podcast. I'm curious because I remember some of our conversation, Alice. Why? What really brought this about?
Yeah, and appreciate Eric sort of sharing, the sort of a tragic thing to happen, and then out of that comes this blossom, right? So it reminds me of like, when we have manure, that's what you grow things in, and blossoms, fruit, vegetables, etc. Didn't want to say the S word, but for me, I worked on a dissertation that was on community organizing and activism by lesbians of color in Los Angeles and New York from like the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And I also had done interviews in the late 90s on tape cassettes with about 55 lesbian of color activists. And it took me a really long time to finish the dissertation because I was, taking jobs and not really interested in being a professor, but, really interested in the work and the research itself. And I had friends and, just other people telling me, "Alice, can't wait till the book is out." And it took me so long to write the dissertation that I just didn't have it in me to write a book. And I actually didn't want to just like write a book where it would be used in, college campuses, universities, people have to pay $40 for it, etc. And I wanted something more democratic. I wanted something more accessible to people. And I thought I should do a podcast. And when I got started on that, a couple of years ago, and it still isn't out yet. So this is like, it takes a long time for me at least to kind of get something going. And I wish I had that, like, 5 week and just boom, get it done. And it's not happening for me in that way. But what it meant was I really wanted to have a platform where these stories could be heard by everyone, not just by people who think, oh, I'm going to take a class on gay, lesbian, queer history, or in, ethnic studies, etc. And I wanted it to be broader. So I thought a podcast was that platform for democratizing accessibility for stories to come out. And this is still the case, right? When we read history books, or when we read even, newspaper articles, LGBTQ people of color might be subjects in a particular kind of way. They might be like the object of the story, but not the subject per se. Their voices or lived experiences are not seen in a particular kind of way. And also, I wasn't just kind of wanting to like, oh, it's all just white queers we're seeing. I also wanted to just, it wasn't just about additive, like, let's start including queer people of color. My thought was, when you question how things are written already, when you question sort of the structure and the policies, everything around it. So it wasn't just like adding people of color and then it's okay. Like, why are they left out in the first place? And where might LGBTQ people of color be, but we're not seeing it as queer? So for instance, I would say like maybe they're in different movements, but maybe they weren't able to be out. So I think there's a way for us to query where LGBTQ people are and in what movements, and why might they be only seen as like, oh, well, they're in, the civil rights movement, and that's only talking about civil rights, as opposed to that all of these things are intersecting. So that's a little bit of why I wanted to start my project. And also I had these historical stories, but I also wanted to know what was happening now. So part of my work was to interview current day activists so that we could have some dialogue between the different generations, and also know like, oh man, if I had known what folks were doing, 10, 20, 15, 20 years ago, 30, etc., it would have so much resonance with what's going on now, especially, right now, the pandemic, etc. I think we can learn about AIDS history, AIDS activists, how do we get through different kinds of pandemics? So I just wanted to do that.
Right. That's a really great point, that, the accessibility and the ability to see yourself within the history and who we think about in the history has been really shaped by a very narrow focus. And not by academics, but, well, some by academics, but really how we're absorbing it now. And so I've noticed with all of your podcasts, there is an attempt to really figure out what counts, right? How do we talk about these people? How do we include these really complicated ways? And speaking to Alice Y's point around that democratization, around who gets represented, what are some techniques that you all use around how we talk about historical figures? One of the biggest things that I run into in education now is, we don't want to label people because, one, it's anachronistic, it's not, language that they use, but we also want to be able to claim and be able to see ourselves reflected. I know I just listened to part of the podcast about the Mahu people in Hawaii, and I'm wondering, Jason or Alice M., what were some of your considerations in how you talk about historical figures in that way?
I think the most important thing for us kind of doing history and talking about historical figures is acknowledging all those things you just said, like acknowledging the ambiguity of how we relate our modern identities to past identities, and acknowledging that we often can't ever and won't ever understand how an individual understood themselves, or how they either labeled themselves in the time they lived, or how they hypothetically would have labeled themselves if they lived today. And it's not often all that productive to say, oh, well, if they were alive today, they might have called themselves such and such, or they might have called themselves such and such, because we just don't know. So I think it's important for us to just acknowledge that and be really clear about the fact that we don't know, and we don't want to stick these very specific labels and say, this person was a lesbian or this person was trans, to be aware of that ambiguity And also just embrace that ambiguity and say, look, we don't know what this person identified as, but we can connect with them. You know, I can connect with them as a bisexual person, or somebody else might connect with them as a lesbian, or so forth, and say we can all have this connection with them, but we don't have to say for sure what they would have seen themselves as, because we just don't ever have that knowledge.
Are there any techniques that you use to be able to continue to have that connection, even as we are respecting that we can't, well, we shouldn't label in a definitive manner? Lee or Jason, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak a little bit to that. I mean, one of the goals that we had when we started the podcast, I up until recently had a co-host. We had considered, we wanted to do a show that was really looking at finding the queerness that has always existed in history. There was so much scholarship around, you know, queer identities and queer people in activist movements, and you know, going back and finding it where there was not necessarily the same kind of language we use. So I think in terms of like techniques, we actually did our very first episode, our very first like trailer episode was a 10-minute long episode on the language that we decided that we were going to use, especially doing things like, you know, calling a podcast History is Gay, and having that be kind of the umbrella term that we were going to be using, but doing it as a tongue-in-cheek and saying, hey, here's all of this complexity. So I think what Alice said, being really mindful of language and contextualizing it, and saying, here's how we can connect the dots and say, you know, if you find elements of this story resonant to your story, then claim it. But we can't necessarily, you know, say, when we don't have somebody's own words, there's really not much we can say. But it's been really wonderful to be able to find instances where somebody was talking about their own experience. You know, like that's one thing that we don't have the luxury of, you know, having a trove of oral histories. When you're digging through secondary sources, trying to figure out how somebody may have identified. I think it's been really interesting to, Alice, why, like what you were saying, finding the queerness in various areas where it may not have existed, in the way that we think about queerness. One thing that we had done was, you know, people were asking, was Lizzie Borden a lesbian? And we did a whole episode kind of investigating that, and found out that, you know, the questions around that were really mostly due to something that was like a novel, but then we used that as a jumping off point to talk about the inherent queerness of the term spinster, and whether or not there's something that could be kind of analogous to modern day understanding of asexual identity. So I think it's important to have a lens that is wide open, and looking through all these different perspectives.
Eric.
If I may, one of the challenges I found with some of the interviews I did from decades ago, well, in particular, the Sylvia Rivera interview, when I interviewed Sylvia in 1989, Sylvia said, call me Ray or call me Sylvia. And when I wrote about Sylvia in the original 1992 edition, I referred to Sylvia as he, because Sylvia identified, people didn't identify quite in the way we do now.
Right.
So Sylvia identified as Ray Sylvia Rivera. So that would be unacceptable now. So I find that some of the rigidity that we now find, the rigid place we now find ourselves in, that there's less room in some ways for people to be fluid, at least historically, so that I had to be reminded by my executive producer a few times when we were doing I was doing the narration. She made me correct myself because I was accustomed to referring to Sylvia with a male pronoun. And she said, you'll get killed for doing that. And it was a mistake because I wanted to refer to, I have the script written, obviously. So it's something I never discuss actually. So, because it doesn't feel like there's room in the world we live in now for that kind of ambiguity about someone who is now a trans icon. But that wasn't Sylvia Rivera in 1989 when I interviewed Sylvia Rivera. And I interviewed Marsha P. Johnson as well, and that was also a complex issue based on how Marsha identified at the time.
Yeah,
Eric, thanks for that, because, you know, that historians are always grapple with, you know, the naming, and you know, I've been a little loose with saying LGBTQ people of color, queer and trans people of color, and right now, you know, I feel like I can do that. But if I was talking about a particular period in time and only those words were being used at that time, I would try to use the terminology of the time, right? And I think that there's, you know, gay might have been used in a particular kind of way, queer was used in the early 19th century in a particular kind of way. So I think that we could be cognizant of those specificity and terms used at, you know, certain historical moments, and we might have to be careful about that, because sometimes we're a podcast is conversational, you know, we're not trying to sound like a history book and reading something, but I think there's also a way for us to be true to the person who you spoke with at that moment. And they might have, you know, there's ever evolving, like somebody who identified as a lesbian could be trans now. And right, so we could say, how do we talk about them when they identified as lesbian in the 1970s, but in 2020, they now identify as, you know, a trans person, right? And so we could maybe talk about that. And I think that just helps us and gives our audience a way to think about the complexity of our identities, how they're ever evolving. What we might say today could change tomorrow, and allows us that room to just be like human, like a human experience could be different, and we evolve. So that's a little hard, and I can see how it's tricky, because sometimes when we're thinking about history and we don't have them speaking in the, you know, 1700s, like, how do we know if they had sex with another woman and that they are lesbian, you know? So there's always that question. And I feel like, well, then we use the romantic letters that they wrote, or, you know, there's a way to get at something. So that's the big conundrum, I think, for historians anyways, when they're trying to talk about the past and not use present day language to talk about the past.
Right. And then we run into another complication as queer folks, right? I was just doing a training with Channing Joseph out of USC the other day, who wrote about drag after the Civil War. And one of the things that he was saying is the way that we use LGBTQ and the lexicon that we have today would not describe them. And in fact, derogatory terms, as we understand them today, would be the ones that they would be using. The least derogatory term that he brought up was Twilight men for folks at the time. But the other ones, you know, like the F word or any of the other things, or even queer, right? As far as that goes, are things that they would have claimed more as their identity. And so it puts us in this strange place. Alice M., I saw you had something to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, going off what Alice Y was saying about sort of the format, the conversational format of podcasts, I think we're very lucky in that podcasts bring that in a way that a lot of other history formats don't. And I will be upfront, I haven't listened to all of your podcasts, but we're very lucky with the format of our podcasts that it's very conversational. And so we've had situations where we've done an episode. An example I'm thinking of is Christina of Sweden, who was got to remember this, 16th century monarch, gender non-conforming European monarch. And I presented that episode and chose to use they, them pronouns. Did I? No, other way around. I presented that episode and chose to use he, him pronouns for Christina. And there was a point in the episode where one of my co-hosts said, you know, I don't think that's necessarily the right call. I don't think based on the evidence that you have, you can say Christina was a man. I think we should be acknowledging that Christina may have been non-binary if they had those words today. And so because we're a podcast, we're able to be really open about those conversations. And I think for people who aren't necessarily historians or haven't done a lot of work in that space, they are expecting these black and white answers. And it's very valuable to be able to bring that nuance and bring that understanding that there's a lot of different potential answers that we just need to debate and grapple with.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. is I kind of see the role of podcasts and podcasters as kind of liaisons between the academic and the lay people, quote unquote, who are listening to these things. It's especially in a show where it's based on research, like Queer as Fact or History is Gay, where we're taking a topic and going and researching and presenting what other academics have found and interpreting that for a modern audience. I think it's a way for us to pick those things apart, but present them in a way that people can understand without all of the ivory tower academic language, which is, I think, a specific point of our show. Is we knew going into it we wanted to approach it with humor and lightness and tongue-in-cheek. Like, we have a segment at the end of every episode that's like, how gay were they, and we rate them on a scale that has become more and more surreal as we've gone on. Started as a 1 out of 10, or 1 to 10, and has gone to just whatever crazy things that we can come up with. Yeah, and I think we talked about in our prep session about the ability to use podcasts as a way to reach young people, young closeted people, in a way that, like, a queer history book or a book on, a book that has the word gay in the title would be somewhat dangerous for a young closeted person who may not be in an affirming environment. To be able to, listen to these stories privately in a headphone, in a podcast app that's buried in their phone is a very different experience, I think.
Right. And I think you touch on something really important there. Something that Alice Y brought up earlier as well is, as we talk about queer history, how do we define that, right? How are we figuring out who is included in what we talk about? I know that in every single one of your podcasts, say for Mary Eric's, because you did direct interviews with folks in the movement, there's some question about, well, does this count or not, right? How, as Lee put it, how gay is this? How queer is this? And so how do you define for your different audiences, or for your shows, what is queer history? I know, for example, Jason, you have another podcast around, oh my gosh, I'm blanking, but another podcast that, in my opinion, is queer history through a particular lens, right? But does that count? Do you count it?
Yeah, so we do sort of mini series within Queer as Fact called Queer as Fiction, where we talk about pieces of media that deal with historical time periods, or pieces of media that are old enough themselves at this point to sort of qualify as queer history. The definitions of that can get a little bit loose. I'm sure any of our older members of our audience will cringe a bit when I say that we've done an episode on, for example, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which obviously doesn't feel that old, but is 25 plus years old at this point. And yeah, often it can be a case of defining sort of how queer a piece of media is, and I think that can be a little bit clearer with media sometimes, but then we've also done episodes on, especially as you get further back into history, and one of our episodes dealt with very, very far back into history. We dealt with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest pieces of media that we have, full stop. And trying to pass through a document that old and talking about how queer it is and what constitutes queer in that context can be really, really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
I'm a both and kind of person. I don't like the whole, like, it's got to be one thing or nothing, or, what is queer is this, and we got to define it in this way.
Sure.
And I think in some ways, when we're trapped with having to define something, we get into inclusion and exclusion. And there's a quote by Audre Lorde that is really great. And she said something, the gist of it was like, when you're specific, it doesn't mean like I'm excluding people, but like her naming lesbians of color doesn't exclude white lesbians. In her mind, the way that she talked about it is by being specific, she's actually broadening the joining of it. And what I like about that is, it opens up to see the other frames. Like, what else could we see? Like, part of one contemporary interview that I did, and I only have a trailer out, I don't have the actual episodes, but one interview I did was interviewing parents of LGBTQ kids of color. And people are like, well, why should that be a part? You're talking to the parents and you're not talking to the kids. Like, no, I felt like that would be a part of the organizing, because what they're doing is trying to create that safe and affirming space so that their kids can survive. And that is like so much a part of, keeping us alive. It's, like to have parents do this, right? So I just felt like that's a part of contemporary organizing and community building, because they're a part of it. Like, they're going to these queer API conferences. They're, a part of this. So there's a space for them here. And I think that's, for me, about opening up and queering what is queer, right? Like, is it like they have to have sex with somebody who's of the same gender or not, like, are we going to go that route, and so I think there's a way to be open about it. And for me too, it's also like, oh, I'm interviewing somebody who identifies as trans, but their activism is in undocumented issues, right? And like, that's a queer issue, and so I think there's this way of like trying to figure out like what is queer. Like, we're so caught up in that, and if there's just a different kind of expansiveness that we can have, it would open us up to other ways of seeing, being, and doing our organizing work.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point. As somebody who works at a family organization, there's often a question of, hey, our straight kids, do they count? Are they part of the community? They've been going to pride parades since they were born, right? And so I think that broadening is really important. Now I saw Alice and Jason, both of you had something, so.
I just wanted to sort of build on what Alice Y was saying earlier, before you got into sort of the idea of queer families, but that idea of the specific and the general and the power of taking that specific term, because it was something I was thinking about during the discussion earlier. Particularly, I found when we do episodes on trans people or people who are gender non-conforming, that it can be really important to discuss the possibility of, how this person would identify in a modern context, because I find that, and I know Eli, one of our other co-hosts who's currently asleep, has spoken about a lot, is the idea that people talk about, well, trans people couldn't have existed before surgeries existed. And, this is something that we try to push back against a lot in our podcasts, because it's not really a good understanding of either, the reality of trans people's lives, or really even how they thought about themselves based on the writings that we have. And so, I think that idea of, the and or, like, it's not a dichotomy. You can say, we don't know for certain, we can never understand, as we've sort of mentioned earlier, we can never understand fully someone's internal thoughts about themselves, but we can make these comparisons, and we can say that these people lived an experience that was outside the norms for gender at their time, and then we can talk about that as a trans experience, even if it's not directly comparable to a binary trans person or a non-binary person in a modern context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that's really important to note too is the idea of queerness as an identity is very, very new. This is something that we've discovered over and over and over in our podcast. Is the word homosexual was only was started to be used to describe someone's inner sense of self and identity in the 19th century. Is very, very new in the context of, the entirety of queer history. For the longest of times, it was social roles, it was behaviors that people engaged in. And so to, you know, say what is queer, what isn't queer is really difficult when you have entire societies being based on, you know, same gender relationships and behavior that is also existing in, you know, amid other social roles. And so the concept, you know, when people say that trans people, you know, are new or haven't existed until the surgery, or you know, the surgery or anything like that, is so ridiculous to think about, especially considering that the concept of heterosexuality is even newer than homosexuality, because it for the longest time it was just expected that some level of what we would call bisexuality was the modus operandi for everyone. It was, you know, in many different societies, in your youth you would be you know, you would have an older man who was basically acting as, you know, a mentor into adulthood, and then you would reach the point where it was time to engage in the social responsibility of marriage. And so I think that that is something that is not a lot of people who, you know, aren't in this work know going into it. And it's a common thread that shows up over and over and over, which I think is a really important piece of context.
Yeah, yeah. And so I wonder then, you know, with that ambiguity around basically our history and who's included in it, how did you choose your content, right? You have some really rich stuff, and I'm going to show my bias right now. Eric's stuff in his book, like when I went to college, it was like the only thing that I had, and I ate it up. I did not like history before that, and I ate it up. And there were very few examples, if any, of people who were ethnically like me, right? But it didn't matter because the queerness was spoken to. So
yeah, there's nobody, Rick, there is nobody of Asian descent in the book.
Right.
So I was very mindful of, well, actually, how do I want to think of it? I was very mindful of trying to write a book that was diverse and covered the history. And my principal goal was to tell the history of the movement. I was not telling the history of all LGBTQ people. And especially the early movement was principally male and white. So I struggled to find people who were different from male and white. And it wasn't always easy. So you find one of the people I have in the book is Wendell Sayers. Yeah. In the book I call him Paul Phillips because he didn't want his real name used. And Wendell was involved peripherally in the movement, in no small part because of the danger to him of being out. He was 86 at the time I interviewed him, was involved with the Mattachine Society in the late 1950s. And I had actually gone to Denver to interview a white guy, Elver Barker, and when he told me about his old friend who he no longer talked to because they had a falling out, gay people have never gotten along, by the way. He said, well, you should give Wendell Sayers a call. I haven't talked to him in a long time. He'll be interesting to you. Well, he was so interesting to me, and I didn't need anyone else from Denver. I dropped Elver Barker, and I used Wendell Sayers instead. One of the people I had really wanted to find from those early years was Ernestine Eckstein. So again, my goal was to make this a diverse book, and I really struggled with, especially the early years of the movement. There were almost no Black women in the Daughters of Bilitis. Ernestine Eckstein was one of the few. And she may have even been the only one in the New York chapter, but I can't remember. She was vice president of the New York chapter. I discovered Ernestine Eckstein first in a photograph from 1965. It was a protest in front of the White House. And in this photograph, it's all men in suits and ties carrying signs. And then there's this one woman, African-American, dressed in a skirt and blouse and what were they called? Kitten heel shoes and white cat sunglasses. I couldn't find her, could not find her anywhere. But the beauty of the podcast is that we can do further research, and I'm looking for audio, not to interview the person. And I knew that Ernestine was long since dead by now. And we found in the New York Public Library, in the basement, well, not literally the basement, a 1965 interview that Barbara Giddings and Kayla Husen did with Ernestine Eckstein. And we were able to do a podcast episode about it. So with the podcast, I've had the opportunity to make my original material more diverse. We also did an episode on Bayard Rustin, who was dead by the time I started my book. So it was a real struggle for me. And one of the critiques, one of the rather harsh critiques of my 1992 edition came from another writer who will remain unnamed. And she wrote to my editor, it was an 8.5 by 11 or legal size sheet of paper, column to column typed. But the only line I remember, because of course, writers are sensitive people, she said, "Your book is nothing but the story of white gay men and the white women who helped them." And I thought that was a little harsh. So I went back and I charted the 49 people who were in the original edition. And if you looked at the profile of the movement at the time, the period that I covered, I'm probably going to sound offensive, I don't mean to, that women were overrepresented in the book, but I thought that it was important to include those voices. I probably was not as sensitive to those issues in 1988, 89, 90 as a 30-year-old as I am today. So at the podcast, we work much harder than I think I did at that time to make the book diverse. There was one follow-up point I wanted to make about, what I discovered in charting the 49 people is that fully 1/3 of the people I interviewed were Jewish. And that I found very interesting, that Jews have a long history of social justice activism because of our heritage and culture. And the person who had written the critical letter to my editor was also Jewish, and I wrote her and said, well, I may never have sent the note, but I remember writing a note saying, well, how do you feel about Jews being overrepresented in my book? This is such a sensitive subject, Rick, for me, and I think for everybody. How are we representative of the diversity of our community? And I really struggled with it, and I fell short.
And I appreciate you saying that too, Eric, because I think in some ways, when people read your book, they're motivated to say, hey, there could be a different kind of story here too, right? And, just like why I started my path and do graduate work on, Asian American lesbians, and then, Asian American gay and lesbians, and then lesbians of color, it's because the books that I read were white and were about white gays or white lesbians. And like, okay, I know there's something missing here. And it also gives us a way to say, well, not that LGBTQ lesbians of color didn't exist at that time. They were, doing other things, and they could also have been a part of what we'll call like the gay movement. And that, to me, allows us to open up the frame of what is gay history, right? And so especially with Stonewall too, like Stonewall is really, we could call it the police riot, trans people of color coming against. So instead of saying it started off like, the gay rights movement, it kicked off, obviously queer people have always been policed, right? All the time. So that could be seen as the frame as opposed to it's gay rights, right? So I think there's just ways that we could reinterpret how things are going. And for me, it's like, oh, okay, if there was the peace movement happening in the 70s with a lot of, lesbians a part of the peace movement, like, could the peace movement be seen as a lesbian rights movement as well? So it makes me think about how do we frame these different movements? So the civil rights movement, obviously there were gay people a part of it, Bayard Rustin, huge name, and the unnamed people, right? And so how do we kind of sift through that instead of always thinking, well, gay rights and gay rights only means this, the civil rights only means this. It was already inclusive, right? And I think that would help us when we're kind of trying to think, well, that issue, because it speaks to how things are financed, how things are supported politically. And if we have like, no, I'm talking about people of color it only means X. And we all know, it means so much more than that. And I think this is a way for us to open that up. And I always like, young people, because they're the ones who can kind of get it. I'm in my 50s too, and I'm like, oh, okay, you know, what are the young people doing? They're showing us how things can happen now, right? And there were young queers at that time doing that work. And so I think being a part of that and seeing the openness of how they're expecting things gives us some opportunities to think differently. And that's where I think I'm going with how we can talk about the past and what it means in the present and what kind of future we want, right? So that to me is like the beauty of having these podcasts, is that you're able to have these stories, but also interact with people who want to talk to you, want to write you something. And, you know, I've also been hurt by somebody who wrote something about what I wrote, and like, damn, they just did not get it, but are like, oh no, they're getting it in a different kind of way. So I'm trying to have grace and forgiveness for myself. But I think when we have that, it helps us like understand how can we have some grace around forgiveness too, and be able to hear difficult things, because we need to hear it right now, especially with what's happening politically.
Right.
I also make an important point. It's so hard to hear the criticism, especially, I remember when I got that letter, I thought, I worked 2.5 years on this book. I worked part-time on the side to make enough money to finish this book. I did 3 interviews a day in LA because I didn't have the money to stay any longer than I did. And also she had no idea what effort I'd gone to find people. But she was reacting to feeling left out. But I can tell you, I didn't feel that then. I was just furious.
I hear you.
Yeah, and I've also made a point of never meeting her in the subsequent 30 some odd years. I'm actually going to get up and open my shutters because I'm sinking into the darkness. We have a storm approaching.
Alice M., it looked like you had something to say.
Yeah, building on what Eric and Alice Y have said about kind of the fact that most of the gay rights history we hear about is white and so forth. Another conflict, I guess, that we have making Queer as Fact is we get a lot of suggestions sent into our podcast, and we make an effort to keep track of them all. And we have this huge spreadsheet of about 400 different suggestions we've received of people would like to hear about. And that spreadsheet is incredibly white and incredibly focused on Europe and North America. And so we're trying to kind of balance talking about what people want to hear about. And, you know, people message us because they think, I'm interested in this figure and I kind of want you to, and I don't mean this in a negative way, I want you to do the research for me so I can learn more about this and go more in depth. And like, we're trained as historians. That's what we do. I don't mean that they're just making us do the work for them. And I think it's important that we do that. We do find out more about these figures that people want to talk about, but at the same time, we can't just talk about the people we're asked to talk about, because then we'd be making this very Western white podcast that would be missing out on a huge breadth of queer history around the world. And then we also have this issue that we are a pretty monolingual group, and we are based in a Western country. And so there's a lot of parts of history around the world that we just cannot access because the resources aren't in our language, or the resources are in another country that we just cannot get to. And so it's inevitable that there is more information available to us on these generally white and North American and European parts of history. And if we do an episode on a different place or a different culture, it's going to be less detailed. They're often more broad. So we might talk about, for example, a specific identity in one culture. Whereas if we were talking about somewhere in America, we'd talk about a specific person and do a whole hour-long episode on their life. But we might do an hour-long episode that's basically, let's look at sexuality in this place or amongst these people. So we have to kind of balance those things and acknowledge that we have a lot of limitations, but at the same time really try to overcome those limitations.
Yeah, I think that's really, Alice, that's exactly what I was going to say, in that it really comes down to the sources that we're able to access and find, and also just in general how much was written about folks who are not, you know, in an experience of in a Western country, or, you know, who are white, because even the stories that we have about people tend to be written then by white scholars. You know, we were talking before going live about, you know, so much scholarship on indigenous Two-Spirit folks is from a colonizer's perspective. So how do you give gravitas and respect to representing something that is not your own personal experience, but also making sure that it is showing up as context on the show? And that's something that I personally am working on, trying to figure out what the balance is I want to make sure that I present the stories of people whose experiences are not my own, so that that representation is there. But also I want to make sure that I'm not being disingenuous and, you know, realizing my own limitations as a white person presenting this information. I want to bring people in to have those conversations, but, you know, if we're not able to line somebody up for scheduling or something like that, at what point do we, you know, hold off and make sure that, you know, we're not going to do that episode until we have someone who is appropriate to talk about it with? Or are we doing a disservice to the community by not talking about it at all until we, you know, find we have the right circumstances? So, you know, if anybody has any suggestions on that, let me know.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this whole like conversation about diversity of representation has really resonated with me. We actually just recorded the other night an episode on the documentary Paris is Burning, which a lot of you are probably aware of. And it was striking to me doing the research on this, trying to then, and this is something that's a bit easier for me doing media episodes, they tend to be on more recent pieces of our history, is that I'm able to then go and find sources that are written by academics from those communities, which makes things a lot easier, and, you know, lets me kind of, as a person who, you know, is never going to fully understand the experience of African-American people in the 1980s. You know, if I can read sources by, I think it was Marlon Bailey, who wrote about the ball scene, and the way he talks about it, it's like, oh, wow, okay, I can really, you know, you have this perspective, and I can at least in the episode bring to our audience the voice of someone who has been in that community and the voice of someone who understands that experience. And yeah, it is really tough finding that balancing act between not wanting to be the only voice talking about a particular community versus wanting to bring that community to light for a group of people who often don't have necessarily a great understanding of experiences beyond their own. So
yeah, it is. It's definitely tough, and I think, you know, it speaks to what Eric was talking about earlier, even with examples like Sylvia Rivera, right? Just finding the people being able to tell their experiences in the ways that would make sense for the communities that need to hear it, should be hearing it. Now, earlier, Alice M., you mentioned something about the suggestion box and your audiences. And I'm curious then, you know, when you started, each of you, when you started doing this work, who did you imagine was going to listen, right? Who have you found out is actually listening? Is it who you thought it was? And does that shift how you approach your work?
I think for us, we honestly went in with not that much idea if they would listen, and we kind of went, we're going to make a queer history podcast, and it was more about the content than we thought about the audience, which may be the wrong way to go about it, but that's how we went about it. The one thing that we were aware of when we started making the podcast is that we wanted it to be something that could be used as an educational tool by teachers. Obviously, you know, that's age dependent. There are definitely episodes that you wouldn't show to a primary school child or an elementary school child, I guess you would say over there. And so we made a decision, for example, that we weren't going to swear on the podcast because we wanted it to be age appropriate. And we also more broadly do include content warnings at the start of an episode. And we know now, having had feedback from listeners, that we do have listeners with kids who'll listen to those content warnings or listen to a whole episode and veto it for their children before they pass it on to their children. So we were aware that we were talking to, or that we wanted to be able to talk to this audience of younger people who especially don't necessarily have access or any knowledge of queer history. And like, you know, growing up as a queer person, I'm sure we all had this experience, you don't learn a single thing about queer history in school. I don't think queerness in any capacity was spoken about in my education, let alone queer history or queer rights or any of that. So I think that's one facet of our audience we thought about, and probably the only facet we thought about. And another factor about audience that definitely didn't think about at the start, but I've considered more recently, is we assume when we make our podcast and the way we talk in our podcast that we are queer people talking to queer people. And we've got some feedback from parents of queer children who may not be queer themselves, that they're learning about queer history through our podcast. And I know my own mother, for example, also listens to the podcast. And having spoken to my mother about this, that means that sometimes she doesn't understand words or phrases that we think are common knowledge. Like, we've talked about asexuality on the podcast, and I'll sometimes say ace instead of asexual. And my mother's come to me and said, what's this word ace? What are you talking about? And it's not that she hasn't heard of asexuality, but it's that she's not used to these casual ways that we talk about as queer people, which have a level of assumed understanding. So I think that's something we have to start thinking about as well, is are we perhaps going to alienate some people if we assume we're only talking to queer people, and are we perhaps losing a valuable chance to educate and connect with non-queer people and improve their understanding?
So funny. We went the exact opposite direction in terms of language and swearing, Alice. We decided we were trying to figure that out, and then in our first episode we were just like, nope, you know what, this is we're gonna get too excited about people. But what's funny about that is that we fully expected our audience to be adults, and we've gotten emails from young kids or, you know, young teens that are discovering things about themselves and about queerness and queer history. And it's always, you know, it's a twofold. It's like, who's letting you listen to this? We say so many bad words and we talk about some really sexually explicit things, and we warn people at the beginning, but like, okay. But also I think that's really changed the way that I've approached the show, knowing who is listening and knowing that there are people it blew my mind when I found out that people were listening all over the world, that we had, you know, people in Russia and in Guatemala and in China, and to be able to hear from folks who are, especially folks who are in countries that have really strict censorship laws and you know, really kind of homophobic or transphobic governmental policies, to be able to hear from folks to say, listening to this made me feel like I know a little bit more about myself, or gave me ammunition to fight against these experiences of hate and discrimination, which was really profound for me. We had somebody email us like just the other day who just looks like they're like 10 or 12 years old, and sent an email just like, can I ask you a question? Is it weird to be gay? Is it weird to want to be gay? And I was just like, no, being gay is great. No matter what you are, who you are, what you're doing, like, exploration of yourself is always a good thing. And to know that, you know, our shows and our voices are a part of that is really important, and also really scary. There's a lot of, when you realize you have an audience, there's a lot of responsibility, especially when, like, you know, when you're in some ways seen as an authority, and I'm sitting here like, I'm just a kid at home with my bookshelf. Like I'm not an expert in any of this. I'm mostly just, I'm like Alice was saying, I'm doing the work. You're telling me what you want to listen to, or I'm finding something that I want to learn more about, and then I go and I do the research and I present it back to people and say, hey, look at these cool folks that I found. Let me tell you some really fun stories.
Yeah, it's interesting, listening to how we present our interpretation and our vocabulary around queerness. As somebody who does trainings for mixed groups, predominantly straight, actually, it's funny because a lot of my middle term terminology is too much for straight audiences who aren't used to listening to queer stuff. But then if I stay at that level, the queer people in my audience will go, well, you didn't say it right at all. You didn't say enough. So it gets really interesting. But I do know, what you were talking about, Lee, about the reach to other places. I know Eric has a really rich story around that, and you had your hand raised earlier, so I just want to acknowledge that.
What is the rich story, or are you guessing it's a rich story? Because
No, I remember your story about that girl from Russia.
Yes, Mina, who writes to me. In fact, I owe her an email she wrote just the other day. She's a disabled kid living in Russia. When she started writing to me, I think she was 15 or 16. She translates Making Gay History's transcripts, posts them on her blog, so that other LGBTQ Russians who don't speak English can follow along with the podcast. We have had episodes also translated into Portuguese and Spanish. And I just had an email from someone in Germany today. So I never anticipated we would have an international audience. We've been downloaded in more than 200 countries and territories around the world. I'm guessing, Lee, you've had the same experience. 25% of our audience is outside of the US, and they range in age from 11 to people in their 80s. And for the younger listeners, what they tell us is the podcast gives them a sense of their history, of their heritage, gives them a sense of community, and gives them a sense of pride in who they are. For the older listeners, it's feeling seen, that their stories and their experiences are worth telling.
Yeah, and it's really important to be able to find that there. I think, or Jason, were you unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to kind of this general conversation about the complexity of language and how to kind of talk about queerness and how to talk to a particular audience. That's something that, I think we've had a lot of trouble with, because often, particularly with our media episodes, often if we were to go into every episode assuming that people knew very, very little, we would be repeating the same conversations. And, when we do 10 episodes in a season, we do 2 seasons a year, that's roughly 20 hours of content that we have to encompass as much of the queer experience across the entire world as we can. So it's a very broad focus, and it's a very limited amount of content, even though sometimes our episodes do run a little long. But it's tough finding that balance between having a kind of repetitive conversation where we're saying similar things that we said in a previous episode versus trying to be accessible to people. And, I think sometimes we can underestimate our audiences, and they show that they really do have a deep understanding of the content that we're bringing out. But other times, it is going to be the case that some people are just going to, not click with some of the terminology that we're using. And they're sort of going to be like, wait, hold on. Can you step back and take me back to, a kind of middle school education perspective on queerness. And it can be really tough. I had another point, but I've lost it, so I'll head back to you.
That makes me wonder, though, for all of you, Jason, you just talked about how you are cognizant of the fact that the language that you use sometimes might be too much or too little or whatever it is. Do you treat your shows as scaffolding off of each other? Like, do you increase the vocabulary as you go on, or do you re-explain things that you do as if somebody might just come into your podcast?
For us, I don't think we consciously sort of treat it as scaffolding. Like, we won't necessarily introduce a concept and not explain it because we've explained it once before, but we do, and I think it's just as we do our own learning, we do constantly reference back to other episodes and compare queer experiences and say, oh, you know, this is a bit like what we saw with this person, or, you know, maybe we can use this angle that we've seen in this other episode to try and understand the experience we're seeing now. So I think for our listeners, it probably is more, they do get more depth out of it if they were listening all the way through and sort of learning with us as we're learning. But it's not necessarily like a prerequisite where you have to have heard this episode in order to hear a new episode. But it's really going with us on our journey as we increase our understanding. We're able to bring more depth to what we're doing. And we hope our audience is following along and increasing their understanding at the same time.
Alice, as somebody with an educator background, do you approach that differently? Do you scaffold intentionally, or you?
You know, I'm still, you know, trying to figure out things with getting this podcast up and running.
Sure.
And for me, I'm a little more loose, you know, and it's a little difficult because I have this body, and similarly, maybe I'm curious about how Eric has, you know, chosen from his archive, right? Because, and you already had written a book, and so I have like this dissertation, and like, do I try to capture a story from what I wrote and then sort of just, you know, make a snippet of it and have it come out differently? And I think that's the difference between writing and having something that should be listened to. And I, you know, my scripts are usually, I write for it to be read, not to be heard. And you have a different storytelling process when you are trying to get something to be heard as opposed to be read. And I think that to me is the hardest part for me, because I'm just so used to writing for something to be read as opposed to be heard. And, you know, I love an oral history. I would like listen to it for an hour and a half, and, you know, but an audience is not going to listen to something for an hour and a half. And that's where, like, why don't they want to listen to it for an hour and a half? And so it's a struggle to kind of say, no, you got to make it really short, concise. And so that's the hard part, because I'm like, this is, oral historians always have a hard time, like, you know, the wheat from the chaff. It's like, what's really the kernel that you want to get out? And I'm like, but everything's a kernel to me, you know? And I think that's the difficulty of trying to figure out what's the story you want to tell that would grab somebody's attention and give them what they need without having to add more context. Because I'm like, well, I got to give them the history of this, and so they can understand that and understand this. And no, you just tell them that story. So I'm still trying to grapple with what to provide to people and what's too much. Because I'm like, oh, I wanted a half hour, you know, episodes. Like, no, it can't be a half hour. I'm like, why not? And so I'm debating how to have that happen. And then it's good to have a producer who can kind of say, hey, that's not going to fly. And for me, in doing my work, I wanted to find, you know, LGBTQ people of color to help produce this with me, and who would help me with the story writing. And I had some people, and, you know, they had to find jobs. I got a new job. So it's just difficult for me in terms of getting this out. And I could be rough and tumble with it and just like press record, do something. And I'm a little bit of a more perfectionist, that I can't do it that way, which is not to say anything that other people are not, but I find it challenging in some ways, and maybe it shouldn't be. And I need to just talk to somebody who can, like, it's really easy and we could help you. And if you want to help me, like, get in touch with me, because I obviously need some help.
I mean, I think that's one of the benefits of having like a conversational podcast, because we do have hour and a half long episodes, but I think it's mostly because we're like, oh, but yeah, everything is a kernel. I need to tell everybody this exciting thing. Yeah, I understand that struggle, Alice.
Alice, it is painful. I find it always to be so. I was supposed to have written a script today, and here it is 4:18 in New York City. And I have not written it yet. I was supposed to write it yesterday, because it will take me maybe an hour, hour and a half when I actually do it. But I always find it painful and I put it off. The problem with what you're doing and what I do is you have to leave almost everything on the cutting room floor. Both your oral history material You get to use a tiny percentage of what you've recorded and your narration. And the narration is not the kind of narration you would have in a book. And I was very lucky to have a producer who worked with me at the beginning, and I was able to catch on fairly quickly. It's a very different kind of writing. You can't have dependent clauses. The sentences have to be short. You can't pack it with, as the line I got over and over again was, this is not a history lesson. You're going to put them to sleep. And so it was, I'm into my 8th season now, so I have a much better sense of it, but it's painful. Like, we know so much. We know the whole story, but even the oral histories we take are only a slice of someone's life. So the way I think of it is we're just giving people a taste, but the story that we present, the oral history, still has to have an arc. So it has to be edited in a way that people are accustomed to hearing a story being told. I follow Studs Terkel's rule of oral history. Studs Terkel is a famous oral historian, and we're partnering with his archive for this season and drawing on his archive. When asked about how he did his work, he said, I mine for gold. So it's extracting that golden thread from all the material you have and feeling the cuts right here every time you leave someone's story on the cutting room floor. With the Holocaust podcast we do, I find it excruciating because we wind up leaving out things that are so profound, and with the gay stories too. So you're just going to have to learn how to suffer. There's no cure. There's no easy answer.
Very Jewish thing to say, Eric. Just learn how to suffer. Learn how to embrace the suffering.
I was going to say there's a line in my most recent script where I say, I'm sorry, we can't talk about all of this. We could do an entire season of the podcast on this one specific part of this episode. So here's a very brief overview in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you talk about, the different things that you do with your shows, there is a question from the audience, and it's from Aubrey Calvin, asking, do you worry about trying to distinguish your podcast identity from the many others that are out there? And it's funny because I kind of was like, Aubrey, were you listening to us before we started recording? Because we were talking about this. So, anyone?
I mean, I think the really beautiful thing about it is that I've always come at it from a perspective of the more that's out there, the better. Like, even if we're talking about the same sort of things or even the exact same topic, no one is going to talk about it the exact way that you're going to be able to do. Everyone has their own perspective and approach to the material, to the interviews. And so I think it just builds a library of knowledge that everybody can access. I mean, I think there's, in the world of media, there's like such an emphasis on standing out and, the idea of competition. And I don't like that. I mean, there are so many people doing what we do, and I'm just really excited to see what somebody else has to say on something that I found interesting. We were talking before we went live about, I've known the Queer as Fact folks for quite some time, and our topics tend to overlap a lot because we have a pretty similar structure, and I make a conscious effort to not listen to an episode that they've done on a topic that we're going to cover until we have already covered it, because I want to make sure that I, give you the space to have your own independent identity in talking about the same thing, and that we're not, accidentally kind of cribbing off of one another, and that they have separate identities, and we each have a different way that we present the information, different jokes and ways that we interact with the stories, and I don't know, I want more people to be doing this, mostly because it's really fun to listen to something and not have to make it at times, because it's a lot of work.
We consciously stay in our lane. I often get pitched by PR people and other people to do new interviews. And what I tell them is, we don't do that. We don't do contemporary interviews. If you want to pitch someone, try LGBTQ&A, Jeffrey Masters. He does, Jeffrey, this sounds morbid, and forgive me for my morbid sense of humor. I do dead people, he does living people. Actually, some people say our brand is crying on the subway. I think of it as and not everyone who we feature has died since I interviewed them, but I do history. And I don't pretend to know what's going on today. I didn't even know what ACE was when you said it, Alice. So it's not just non-gay people, it's gay people who are older. There are generational issues around what we know and what we don't know. And there's something comforting for me working in the past. It's the past I know. And when I hear Jeffrey Masters' show, LGBTQ&A, I don't know who, I know who, occasionally I'll know who the person is he's having on, but they're often well known. In the contemporary gay community, I don't know them. So my lane is the past. And the joy of working with the Studs Terkel archive now is I get to go even farther back in time. Our next episode features a 1959 interview with Lorraine Hansberry. I was born in 1958, couldn't possibly have interviewed Lorraine Hansberry. I like the past, and maybe it's because of my age. I'll be 62 in a few weeks, but that's my lane, is the far past. And I love that you're all doing, most of you are doing contemporary history. Well, actually, you're talking in the present day about the past, and bringing your lens, or seeing it through your contemporary lens, which is very different from mine.
I was going to say, as the token media person on a podcast with 3 history majors, it's not your age that makes you into history. It's just some people are history nerds, and I happen to do a podcast with 3 of them, and they are very interested in what is happening in the past.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. From Kathleen. I teach college students and have some enterprising students who have been interested in using local queer history research in a podcast. Do you have advice for brand new podcasters?
My number one piece of advice for brand new podcasters is you can't really know what you're doing or what it's going to look like until you do it. I mean, some people are probably more intense planners than we are, and will like to have everything laid out before they start. But I think really you've got to just get yourself a recording set up. We just bought ourselves a microphone for about $100, I'd say. That was all the equipment we had, and you've got to just jump in and do it and see how it pans out. Yeah, because each podcast is going to be different, as we've said, and each person is going to bring something new to the table. There's not really a how to do a queer history podcast guide. It's just something you've got to start doing and see what your brand is and see what you bring to the table.
I always say keep your expectations low, that you're not going to make a huge amount of money doing something like this. You don't have to have the best equipment in the world, but think about your sound. Right now, because of the COVID crisis, this is what I record on my iPhone, in my closet, my guest room closet, well padded, and it works. It's almost as good quality as a studio space. What makes me nuts is when I hear a podcast that someone has put a lot of effort into, clearly well researched and thought through, but the sound quality is poor. So do yourself a favor if you're starting out doing a podcast, think about the sound quality, because you can't fix that after the fact.
Right. Really sound advice, Eric. And I see we have one actually rather large question in the chat again. If we can get to it, we can, but I also want to acknowledge we're at 128 right now. But as researchers and podcast hosts, do you prefer to make episodes unearthing info of more well-known elements and figures of queer history? Or is it more satisfying to delve into the more obscure stuff?
I have found a slightly different kind of answer to this. My favorite episode that I've done so far is I did an episode on the creation of Wonder Woman and the like original 1940s comics, and the people behind that, who there was a lot of queerness there and a lot of interesting stuff to talk about in terms of sexuality. And so that was really fun to me as an episode, and you know, as a listener before, because I actually only joined the podcast about a year in. One of my favorite episodes before joining was the one on John Maynard Keynes, famously known for like Keynesian economics. And to me, that's really interesting, is talking about people or things that are well known, but not well known at all for being queer. You know, so to me, those are my favorites. But I think there's, a lot of fun to delving into the really obscure stuff, getting right into the weeds of things that no one's ever heard of.
Wonderful.
As well.
Yeah, I think they have different feelings for me. Like, I find it really exciting and validating to take a figure that everybody knows from history and say, hey, did you know that Abraham Lincoln may have been queer? I think that's really validating and satisfying from like an external point of view. But what I find, I think, the most fun is, I mean, I got into this because on the show we joke that we're gay Ravenclaws, and that the process of learning is something that I find really fun. And so one of the people that I had no idea about going into this show and had seen pop up on like a list of, you know, queer historical figures was Claude Cahun, who was a person who, it's, you know, there's scholarship about whether or not you want to call them a lesbian or genderqueer. We ended up using they, them pronouns in the show, but was a surrealist artist who did a bunch of sculpture and photography and artwork with their partner, Marcel Moore, in the 1920s through 1940s, and also engaged in an anti-propaganda campaign, an anti-fascist propaganda campaign against the Nazis. And so many times I come across people that I didn't have any idea about, and I'm just sitting here going, why don't we have a movie about these people? I would go and see that. So I think there's a lot of personal enjoyment in being like, oh, did you know about this person? I didn't.
That's wonderful. I do want to recognize, I could go on talking to y'all forever, but it is a little past 1:32. I want to thank all of you for taking the time, for those in Australia, for really waking up super early to have this conversation with us. Eric joining us from New York. Alice, I don't actually know where you are physically, so thank you.
I'm in Oakland.
For being across the bay from me, and Lee for putting this all together. We really are in the virtual presence of modern day bards, of the stories of our history, right? Things that have not been known, things that have not been known well. And I want to personally thank you for spearheading this new way of communicating the story of LGBTQ queerness in this particular space, especially for times like now, when we're really searching for media that speaks to us, and not just the part of us that is needing the creativity of a fiction, but the part of us that needs to know the truth of who we are and where we come from. So my thanks to all of you. As a close, I'd love to have one word, one phrase from all of us as we go along. And so I'm just going to go on my screen, and so I'll start with Jason.
I don't really know what to say. Yeah, thank you so much for having us on here. This has been great, and yeah, it's very kind of emotionally affecting. I'm starting to get a little bit emotional just thinking about having this whole community of queer podcasters. I know that at least Alice has talked about, you know, when they started Queer as Fact before I joined, you know, the sort of dearth of queer podcasting that there was. So it's great to see how much it's proliferated.
Yeah, thank you. Alice M.
Yeah, I think it's hard to pick a word or phrase to sum up everything we said about queer podcasting today. But thank you very much for having us. Yeah, I got nothing, but thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Alice, why?
I would say community, and I would say for those in the US, please vote.
All right. Eric.
My social media team will kill me if I don't say this final phrase, which is you can subscribe to the Making Gay History podcast at makinggayhistory.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Instagram at Making Gay History, on Twitter at Making Gay History Podcast on Twitter. On Instagram and Making Gay History on Twitter. And we just launched our 8th season. And those who are there, Voices from the Holocaust, you can find at thosewhowerethere.org or also where you get your podcast. And thank you so much for putting together this conversation today. Most of us work in isolation, and it's such a joy to be able to interact with people who are suffering along with us as we try to share this history, which we are all in the business of unerasing.
Thank you, Eric. And last but not least, our illustrious host, Lee.
I guess I'll do the podcast host thing and plug my show. So you can listen to History is Gay podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we're online at historyisgaypodcast.com and on Twitter at historyisgaypod. We have a Tumblr, but that's, you know, not really used these days anymore. And from the society, I want to say thank you everyone for participating. And for those of you who enjoyed this conversation, I would like to let you know that we are having a second conversation along the same topic on November 6th. That one's going to be at 11 a.m. Pacific time, a little bit earlier, but we've got another group of wonderful folks who are going to be talking with us. We're going to be talking to the folks from Bad Gays podcast, Morgan Page from One from the Vaults, and Sally Chum from Afro Queer podcast. So I'm really excited for this conversation to continue and go in some different directions with folks who are doing similar but unique in their own way work. And thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope that you have a wonderful day wherever you are. I'm so pleased to see people from just everywhere coming in for these, and also, you know, the nice thing about us all being stuck in our homes is that we can have these kind of conversations with people we may not have been able to do an event at the museum with. So I thank everybody for participating, and yeah, especially the Australians who are up at 6 in the morning to talk with us. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I'll echo Alice's please vote.
Yeah.
So goodbye, everyone. Be safe, wash your hands, wear a mask.
Thank you, everyone. Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.
Bye.